Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve.
Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. We started this podcast to connect to Mad Men fans like us who pick up something new with every rewatch.
Be advised, this podcast will include spoilers, so we can talk about character arcs all the way through the final season.
We'll be breaking down each episode of Mad Men, discuss the big and small moments, and pose some questions to listeners so we can get your insights. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z. Hey everybody, today we're talking about episode 4 of Mad Men, New Amsterdam, which was written by Matthew Weiner and Lisa Albert, directed by Tim Hunter. With regards to the title, New Amsterdam, I did a little digging and found that the Dutch purchased Manhattan from the Manhattan people in 1626. And as the Dutch settlements expanded, there were some armed conflicts between them. In 1664, the English took over and renamed New Amsterdam, New York, in honor of the Duke of York, who captured it from the Dutch. As the episode opens, when we think about signs of the times, the record that Pete is listening to in his office is The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart. This was the first ever comedy album to reach the Billboard Top 100, and it launched his career. It was a breakout hit. He was a 30-year-old, and he hoped to bring a few more people out to the clubs where he did his stand-up, and instead it changed his life. It says, wasn't that guy an accountant? And he did get a degree in accounting from Loyola, so that's a fun opener that we get the pop culture references from 1960.
And it really is quite a time capsule of an era when comedic records came into great popularity in the 60s, and a lot of the comedians that people would know from the 70s had successful recordings on the phonograph in the 60s.
As we move into the next scene, we get the first appearance of Trudy, Pete's wife, played here by Alison Brie. Her recognizable projects include the Macy's commercials, Glow, Community, The 5-Year Engagement, and BoJack Horseman.
Trudy arrives, and Pete doesn't seem happy to see her. He's with the frat boy crowd in the office, makes the necessary introductions, and then Dawn joins, and he introduces Trudy to Dawn.
And before we get to that introduction, I think it's interesting because we can see Trudy is pretty, she's smartly dressed, she's very confident and adept socially. She knows Harry's wife, Jennifer, and she called Pete's secretary before she was coming to make sure his schedule was free. She didn't call Pete to check to see, hey, is it okay if I come by? She called his secretary and she made it happen. He's not pleased to see her, but she doesn't mind. She's making arrangements, she's making plans. So as Pete is introducing Trudy to Dawn, Peggy happens to be with Dawn as that introduction happens. And of course, they exchange a look, but nothing is said. And what did you think about this moment when Pete is introducing Trudy to Dawn? Did you expect this or something different?
I get the sense the characters are trying to get a read of each other of, has Pete expressed his sentiments about Dawn to Trudy, and is she acting in a certain way towards Dawn? I get the sense his character is trying to read that off of Trudy. Trudy, of course, is acting perfectly acceptably and socially, and Dawn reciprocates. And I think Pete struck me as being proud to introduce Trudy to Dawn. You know, he's of the upper crust. He has all the social graces that maybe this is one of the ways he can start to try and throw another bridge across the river to Dawn, you know, potentially based on now he's married like Dawn.
I was surprised because I thought Don might not be very polite here. He was shockingly polite, actually. He threw a dig. He says something about, we're very pleased to have him around and we need him around here more than you. And she says, I don't think so. And he says, well, maybe you're right. Maybe we don't need him around here as much as you need him. But otherwise, he behaves himself pretty well. And as they walk away, I love this comment. Trudy says, he's so nice, not at all like what I imagined. So you know that Pete has definitely been talking at home about Dawn and all his issues.
I also enjoyed just the casual sexism again of it's Trudy, it's Pete's wife, and they don't even introduce Peggy. So she's the admin assistant. She's not worthy of an introduction, even though she is literally the only person there who hasn't been introduced in the scene.
I had that in my notes exactly too. Yeah, she just smiles politely. That's all that is required of her. I heard Trudy being really happy to be married, and she says, most of my friends can't find a good man. And I'm so sorry to tell you, Trudy, but you have that in common with them as far as I'm concerned. But she has come to the office because she wants to take him out for a minute to look at apartments. She's found 1,500 square feet on the market for $32,000. $32,000 in 1960 would be $345,728 in 2025.
Which would be a bargain for any apartment in Manhattan. So it's interesting, again, this time capsule of a time when housing wasn't outrageously expensive relative to the median income. All that said, when Trudy is going to the apartment with Pete, Pete declares that he makes $3,500 a year. They can't really afford this. And Trudy makes a point of pointing out that they're not in it alone, that they're a young couple that needs help, which is clearly insinuating that the parents have a role to play in making this apartment in Manhattan happen.
As we move into the next scene in the office, we have a short scene with Rachel Mencken. She's walking in with Paul. Paul has been the person who has taken over the creative part of the account, and Dawn looks interested to see her, and she looks interested to see him, but they keep it very professional. Paul excuses himself gracefully, and he says, "How are you?" And she says, "I'm fine. My family's fine. The weather's been spectacular. What are you doing?" And he offers to go get lunch with her, and she says, "I really can't see a reason for that." She admits they would both like it to be different from what it is, but she is holding that barrier there. She's not going to let, she's not going to get involved with him. That door seems closed.
Closed from her side, but in my view, he is trying to open the door or change that status quo and is met with straight resistance. And she's not interested in being a side piece to him or some other woman messing around with the married man. Whereas it appears that Dawn is very much interested in her and would like to use going to lunch as an avenue to start building that deeper relationship. But Rachel turns him down.
And I don't have any sense that she's playing hard to get here, although I do feel like her values are part of what attracts him to her, because she does have standards and she won't break them.
Yes, I saw both a sense of her standards of how to live, her ethics, but also her agency for her own happiness and what she chooses to engage in. And something like this, Rachel's too smart, too dialed into what she's looking for in life to dally or divert herself into something that's a dead end. I think that's how I interpret her rejection of him, that she's not interested in something without a future.
We move into a scene at the Draper household, and Betty is managing the bedtime routine. And you can see that seeing Daddy is a treat. She says something like, "Daddy will see you in the morning," when she's asked to read the bedtime story again. Betty's managing that. And then Betty has to walk the dog that Dawn brought home in the last episode. So now it's Betty's job to manage the dog. So she's out walking. And she goes by Helen Bishop's house, and there's a man knocking on the door and swearing. And this behavior is really against type for their picture perfect neighborhood. So you can see her looking uncomfortable and a little bit scared. And I think it's not an accident that Helen's husband is named Dan. So that makes it even easier for Betty to picture Helen's reality as her own.
I got the sense that Betty was sort of perched on a decision here. She could allow him to use her phone, but that would then draw Betty into this little domestic drama, or she can opt out with the prim and proper and perfectly respectable answer of no, that's not possible. She doesn't let strange men in her house, etc. And she opts for the latter and continues to sort of hear him yelling outside the house about Helen preventing him from being able to see his kids.
And then we see Helen show up at Betty's a little bit later, and she's very honest. She goes to Betty's house and she apologizes. And she says, "I'm really sorry. I'm so embarrassed." And Betty goes, "I don't know what you're talking about." Even though Betty is all about image, I think we can give her a little room with her dishonesty here, because it is politeness when she's denying knowing what Helen is talking about. But Helen is not letting her evade. She is drawing Betty, into it by telling her. Betty, I think, is curious enough that she wants to know more. So she invites her to have a drink, and they have this conversation.
And I think there's a lot of parallels here that Betty's considering Helen's life and where her relationship has ended up vis-a-vis her own. Helen gets into a bit of the details that Dan worked a lot, that he basically had another life in the city. This really seems to track with what we've seen of Dawn and Betty's life to this point. And as viewers, we know about his various dalliances and affairs. It's a straight parallel with Helen's life. And we get the sense that Betty is very much identifying with the situation Helen's in, even if she's not at that point herself yet.
And Helen's observation that Dan hardly saw the kids at all when we were married, and now he wants to see them all the time. So Betty absolutely has that same experience, because Dawn isn't at home with the kids doing bedtime. It's a big event when Daddy is around, right? So he's just not there a lot.
And it's interesting, too, that Helen points out He's the one who betrayed the relationship, but now he's the one who's more angry at her for the fact the relationship has broken apart. And I think Betty's discomfort is partially to do with the honesty and openness of Helen with the problems in her relationship and the post-relationship interactions with her ex. Betty simultaneously feels a great discomfort of just how eerily similar her situation could potentially be to Helen's. At this point, we haven't seen any indication that Betty has any awareness of Dawn's activities in the city.
She definitely does not want to open that box. She turns away from it whenever it's presented to her. And so it's interesting that when Helen shows up, that she does let her in because it feels like she pushes that whole possibility away. But yet she's curious enough about it that I think she's definitely of two minds. When Dawn comes home, all he says is hello. But you can tell he's really irritated that he's not the star of the world. He's made his grand arrival home. And here's Betty talking with somebody else. She's not right there to give him attention. And she's talking with a friend, but he's not coming in to greet Betty with a kiss or anything. He goes right upstairs and Betty goes, he needs complete quiet upstairs for a while. He works so hard. This is another excuse she's making for his rude behavior. And of course, it's more to herself than to Helen.
And again, is Betty getting the attention and consideration you might hope for in a healthy marriage? It doesn't appear to be the case. It's all about Dawn all the time.
And speaking of unhealthy relationships, we move to a scene where Pete is visiting his parents. His father is played by Christopher Allport. You may have seen him in 90210 or Days of Our Lives. And his mother is played by Channing Chase, who was in Bonfire of the Vanities and also in Days of Our Lives. This relationship is so cold and hostile with his father. It might be slightly softer with his mother, but it's just absolutely shocking how completely cold they are to each other.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any father-son affection here. It almost seems like his father is deliberately diverting it into questions about the nature of Pete's work. It's obviously scar tissue and conversations, arguments they've had previously. And Pete says to him at one point, I can't explain how business works to you. And then they roll into the discussion of the actual apartment.
It feels that his father is taking a perverse pleasure in getting to insult him. His mother does not stop this barrage of insults that her husband is flinging at their son. He's got nothing good to say about advertising. And then he says, if you were a lawyer, I could see. If you told me there was more to law, I'd believe you. But what is this? Here's Pete, who's clearly striving so hard and filled with so much ambition. And this man who obviously would be important to him, he cannot win. You do feel sympathy for Pete here, and you think about him being raised in this environment where you could never get approval, right, for anything, probably. This is a hard man to please. So when Pete gets to the moment, I notice he doesn't ask. He tries to make it a statement. We're going to need help with the down payment. I think he doesn't want to belittle himself, but I'm guessing he doesn't come around socially for fun, right? So the only reason he probably would show up is with a request like this.
And I think just as Pete doesn't straight out ask for a specific amount of money, his father's answer reciprocates that evasiveness. He doesn't say no. He says he doesn't think it's a good idea. And then when Pete challenges him on what he means by that, he won't elaborate. The father replies that it isn't about the money. And there seems to be some real truth to that this is about control, power, disapproval, and making sure Pete is very clear where his father stands.
We get a look at that elitism as well. They know exactly what the good neighborhoods in Manhattan are. They have a boat. They're vacationing on Fisher's Island this summer, and they previously went to Montauk. Dawn and Betty do not do this, and none of the others except probably Bert and Roger live in this world. So even though Pete is an underling at the office, he and Trudy belong to a class that assumes that they are entitled to the best things money can buy.
And near the end of the scene, I think we get to what is eating at the father? What's the source of his dissatisfaction? He gave Pete his name, and what did he do with it? So that seems to be an insight into exactly the issue here, that Pete is becoming an ad man, an account manager, and his father has no time for that. And then, not to be too pro-Pete, but when you realize that he didn't want to go ask for money in the first place, and he begrudgingly shows up to do it, and then the worst case scenario unfolds in terms of his father's reaction. I hate to say it, but I'm feeling some sympathy for poor Pete in this scene.
Well, you have to. It's not just bereft of money. They deny him affection here, and we get the sense that this is very normal. He doesn't bring Trudy over for this discussion, even though they've met her and approve of her. His mother says something nice about her. So it really does explain why Pete is always so anxious to claim credit and be admired, because he doesn't have that in his family circle.
And it rolls into the next scene, which is Pete and Trudy in the bedroom, Trudy inquiring how it went with Pete's parents, and Pete fibs that he didn't even ask them for help. So he can't even be honest with her about how that went, and claims that his father has health problems. And Trudy, with concern, honest concern, says, well, what's wrong with him? And Pete says, nobody knows.
I did want to go back and compare Peggy to Pete, because when we think about Peggy, who was so proud of her job just because she did work in Manhattan, and that seemed like such a big deal to her friends and family, and then Pete's family is ashamed of him for not choosing a more worthy profession, really that class distinction couldn't be sharper between the two of them. So it's interesting that they've had this shared history when that is a huge gulf between them. And then Trudy, whose family also has money and she's very mission focused, she does care when Pete says that his dad has been having health problems, and you know that she's close with her family and that's a big concern for her. I know a lot of people are big fans of Trudy, that she's so sweet and so forth, but I think she's a more confident Betty, or maybe a younger Mona. She really gets how to present herself in society, and she knows how to finesse situations with proper social graces. And she does seem genuinely happy with her situation in life, unlike Pete. But she doesn't slow down and attend to any of Pete's concerns either. She barrels ahead to get what she wants, and that's more status and image with a prestigious apartment address.
I can buy that, but I'd also say Pete is not being open and honest himself. And if he were more open and honest, it would probably help her to see what's eating at him and some of the demons he's wrestling with. The fact that he shields and hides away from that and doesn't confess to her or really act honestly with her, I think that that's a major contributor here to her character not getting his character in terms of the angst he feels.
I agree that the dishonesty is a problem in their relationship, but I also think he went over there knowing it could end up as badly as it did, and he went there for her. And you can understand why he would want to lie to her about not asking when they said no. You can understand why that would be humiliating for him. She seems more concerned about the apartment than his feelings at this
Yeah,
moment.
I agree with that. That's her focus. That's what she wants. She's going to get what she wants. And in the answer from Pete, it's clear that she's teed up now to go ask her parents. I just want to put a shout out here to Vincent Kartheiser's acting up to this point in the episode. Pete's going through a bunch of different emotions and interactions, and I really think he does a great job with portraying the character and sucking us into that emotional journey that he's on, and we feel his frustration, his humiliation, his anger, his resentment, his disappointment and his failure.
This episode is definitely a showcase vehicle for him, and I think his best work is to come in the episode yet, but he's doing amazing. Good job, Pete. As we get into that Dawn pitching Bethlehem Steel with Sal and Pete, here we see Randy Oglesby as Walter Veith of Bethlehem Steel. You may have seen him in Pearl Harbor, Liar Liar, and Independence Day. And I hate in this presentation when Dawn throws Sal under the bus. He says something like, well, we can throw this art away in a minute, because he is so put out when somebody doesn't like his concept. So when he does that to another artist, it seems like a really jerk move. He's spending this meeting trying to convince this client that this pitch that they have previously talked about is what he wants, and the client just isn't interested.
And I think what we're seeing here is a lot of frustration on Don's part. Don feels he's got what this client needs. The client should accept it. As we saw already in a couple client meetings, when Don doesn't get his way or the client isn't reacting the way Don wants him to, it sets Don off and he starts lashing out at his coworkers like Sal and Pete. And he starts to take an edge with the actual client, which is where you can see Pete jumping in and trying to dance and deflect that and get out of that session so that they can reorganize themselves and come back with something new or modified, and use the second visit to get the sale here. And Pete references that we always knew this guy would take 2 visits.
Oh, I think that's so charitable of you to ascribe that to Pete. I get the sense that he has been plowed over by his parents and his wife, and here he needs some power, right? Because his father has said, what do you do anyway? What is advertising? It's whining and whoring. And so here he really needs to show some power. And they've already butt heads before. And you can see Don being very good at what he does. He has that compelling 100% focus on his client. It's a real effort on his part. When the client says something negative about the art, Don tries to divorce himself from that. Pete, I feel like, is really trying to make his own self-importance and power greater. He has a couple of really dismissive comments that aren't his place, like, let's not get cute, Don. And that's really not appropriate for him to say in the middle of a meeting. That's only going to escalate Don's irritation.
And this escalation does seem to result in this schism where we start to get inside Pete's head and where this is coming from. And Pete announces that he himself has ideas and that Sterling Cooper is the first place he's been told that he's good with people, as opposed to these artistic skills that Pete's self-describing himself as possessing. I really thought Don's line was funny when he said that Sterling Cooper has more artists and intellectuals than the Third Reich.
Yeah, this scene is full of amazing lines. Probably one of the most famous is when Pete says, direct marketing, I thought of that. It turned out it already existed, but I arrived at it independently. He's so desperate to show that he has value and he has worth. This terribly honest thing then that he says about himself being good with people that nobody has ever said to him before. And that's so true to his core. Of course, Pete would have friends only because of his family and not because of who he really is. And at the same time, when Pete says, oh, I have ideas, you can see Don is not impressed. And you can imagine he gets told this all the time, right? Everybody thinks that they can come up with advertising jingles. And so he's not seeing Pete for what he needs or anything. He just sees, oh, yeah, you're one of those guys who thinks you can do this too. And Pete's needs are so much greater than that at this point. But of course, Don doesn't know that about him, and we can't be sure he would care, even if he did.
I agree. And I think for Don, Pete is offensive to his own creative abilities, and Pete's attitude is offensive to Don's code about his job and what he's supposed to do as creative. And one of Don's shots at Pete is to say that Pete wasn't prepared, insinuating that Pete's not pulling his end of the negotiation in pitching and supporting the creative pitch to the client.
He's not cowed, though. Someone hadn't prepared him to like the idea, Don says. And Pete goes, I'm sorry I didn't lower his expectations enough. So gloves are off.
It's open warfare at the end of that session.
We move back to Betty's house. She's trying to get dinner together, and Helen calls and wants her to babysit. She's going to stuff envelopes for Kennedy. I'm guessing she's the outlier on the block there. And Don has told us that he doesn't vote. And here Betty says she's not informed about the election. And she looks into the living room where Don is on the couch looking at art while the kids watch TV. And she says, oh, well, I guess Don could watch the kids. And this is a huge favor because obviously that's not something Betty asks of him regularly.
Unlike Betty's put together house where everything's perfect, Helen's is a mess. And Betty really notices the state of the house, and obviously it's not living up to the expectations and standards that she's used to. Betty extends a polite compliment to Helen and mentions, oh, maybe there's some nice men at the campaign. But Helen responds that it's mostly women. And then Helen heads out the door, leaving Betty with Glenn.
We're going to leave that there, except to say that Glenn is played by Martin Weiner. This pretty much is his recognizable project, and he is Matthew Weiner, the writer-creator's son. In the next scene, we get Pete and Trudy with Trudy's parents, Joe O'Connor from Melrose Place and the Green Hornets, her father, and Sheila Shaw from Erin Brockovich, Shameless, and others, playing her mother. And they are in such contrast to Pete's. Her father says he wants to come back as an ad man, whereas Pete's father disapproves of his career, and her father sees the good side, and he tells Pete to call him Tom or Dad. He opts for Tom. And you kind of doubt Pete ever calls his own father Dad. They instantly hope that their great news is pregnancy, but when they find out at the apartment, they're genuinely excited and very expressive. So it seems like maybe they're more of a new money class than Pete's family's reserved old money class.
And it's just such a contrast with the conversation Pete had with his parents. So they're instantly approving, looking to see how they can help. Pete says, no, thank you. There's no need. It's out of our range. Trudy's dad insists that he's making an investment in Pete and Trudy together. Trudy's glowing, so happy that they'll get the assistance they need. And again, as we look at Pete's face in the scene, we can see how this is just reminding him of all the things that he doesn't get with his parents. And again, I think reminds him that this is Trudy's project, Trudy's plan, and it's coming to fruition because of Trudy's parents. So again, he's disempowered and being dragged along in this rather than leading the charge or being the main agent of what's going on.
And I think you kind of admire Pete for not jumping at the chance to take the money. In the next scene, we see it's wariness. It's not just principle, but I think he does see some value in earning it and achieving it and proving himself as opposed to having it handed it to him by his father-in-law.
And the next scene really drives it home that, Trudy's really happy, says that Pete can't possibly be angry with how things have gone. Pete's wondering what it means. I suspect in his relationship with his parents, everything came with conditions. So he's anticipating what might be the conditions from her parents. And, will they tell them where to put the furniture, he says. Trudy challenges him on his parents versus her own parents and that there's a difference between the two of them. And Pete doesn't really offer any rebuttal to that.
But she's also overriding him at every juncture. She showed up at his office. She secured the money for the apartment. And even here, he says, turn on park. I need to meet a client. And she says, oh, hush, it'll only take a second to the cab driver. And then he's silenced. He has no voice. He has no agency. She's in charge.
It's been a bad couple of days for Pete.
Speaking of a bad couple of days, Betty is babysitting. And of course, she snoops in Helen's bathroom cabinets. So, you don't admire her for that. But we know she's curious about Helen's life. And she sees her jewelry and some birth control pills. And you wish Betty had better behavior to match her exterior. But you can see who she really is when nobody's watching.
And while she's in the bathroom using the toilet, Glenn comes in the room and she scolds him and tries to shoo him out, and he stands there. So she actually has to get up and physically usher him from the bathroom. When she finishes and comes out, Glenn's on the couch and Betty confronts him and chastises him, saying that room is very private. Glenn is starting to cry and apologize. And at this point, Betty starts to soften. She can see that she's having a harsh effect on him. And then Betty switches into a more consoling tone. He hugs Betty. I think at that moment, Betty probably desperately needs a hug herself. She tells Glenn that she's not angry anymore. Glenn then compliments her that she's pretty, really pretty, and asks her age. He says that she looks like a princess and has beautiful hair. It's clear that in a world where Betty's not getting any of these forms of positive attention, that even though it's coming from a child, she's realizing how much she craves this and how much she's missing this.
So Lisa Albert, who co-wrote this episode with Matt Weiner, says on the DVD commentary that she thought this whole scene was creepy, especially the hair piece. And Matt Weiner's point of view was that Betty is a child and she feels like this is a real relationship, that she's not fully formed and she's playing at being a grown-up. And it is creepy, and that's the point. That's his point of view. Now, I know he's the writer and the creator, but I disagree with this whole thing about Betty being childish because Dawn throws regular tantrums and runs away, and he's childish on the regular. Pete, also childish on the regular. So to put that on Betty as her defining characteristic does not seem right to me. She's about image, and she's spoiled, and she doesn't have a lot of depth that we've seen, but she keeps her obligations, and she's responsible with her house and her home and her work and her kids. She's just deeply lonely. And any kind of attention is welcome. And somebody noticed her. That's not childish. That's sad. It might be hard to feel sorry for her because she's beautiful and she's got wealth. Get over yourself. And her two-dimensionality is something you would wish she'd work on. But nothing in her society asks her to be anything more thoughtful or meaningful. All of the attention she receives is for her looks. And all she can do within this system is lose.
I agree with you. I don't think she's especially childish or childlike, and definitely not in this scene because she uses her power as an adult to chastise Glenn, sees that she's put it on a little thick and she's broken him down, and then she backs away from that. And in return from this person that is crying and knows that she's upset with him, he's still so obviously infatuated with her that he's throwing her compliments that I think she's starving or dying of thirst in the desert, and these are little cups of water. I do think that giving him a piece of hair is creepy, but okay, I'll just accept that that's what happened, and odd things happen.
And this brings us to this episode's double dip question. Do you think Betty or Pete is more deserving of sympathy? I find this a little challenging, but we are interested to hear your insights. You can visit www.madmenc2z.com. That's letter C, T-O, letter Z.com. And please share your insights. We'll discuss this question with views from our listeners on a future episode.
The next scene has us with Pete and Walter in a nightclub in New York City. Pete introduces his cousins, some lovely ladies who are obviously there to provide companionship for Walter as part of his stay over in Manhattan. Pete's working hard to keep Walter happy. They morph into discussion of work. Pete's talking about his ideas for the campaign for Bethlehem Steel. Walter makes it clear at that point that he's really not that interested in talking about business. He's the lecherous old guy who wants to get to know Pete's cousins a little better.
And it's not clear if Pete envies Don's creative job and that's why he's pitching. I don't know that he necessarily wants Don's job. It's just clear he needs a win. He needs something demonstrable to prove to himself he can succeed. So it's like, okay, I'll do it here because Don's not here to get in my way. And when the guy shuts him down, Pete just sits there and he's paying the bills. So he gives the barest sad nod of approval to the waiter at the bottle of champagne, and he's alone in the crowd again. So, Pete, this is a rough night for you.
And the part I really like about the writing, which we'll find out in the next couple scenes, is we feel that Pete has failed again at pitching his ideas to Walter and registering his ideas. So as far as we know, there is no idea for Bethlehem Steel. We'll have to see what Sal and Don come in with the following day.
When Helen comes back from her evening working for the Kennedy campaign, she brings Betty some literature, and Betty goes home and she sees Don is in bed. He's gone to sleep thinking about solving his work problems, so he hasn't made any time for her. And he, quote, watched the kids so she could help Helen out by working on the sofa while the kids watch TV. He has not put time into his family. He's putting it into winning the account. So here Don has expended his energy and his time away from his family. And when they get into the meeting the next day, it turns out the client loved Pete's idea. What do you think about this?
Don intros their new pitch, which is about the little town of Bethlehem Steel. Walter immediately says, look, I know that's not what you want to sell me. Talks about what Pete had mentioned, Bethlehem Steel being the backbone of America. Walter's clearly sold on that. He says it's concise, it's strong. Pete has a smug look on his face like when the Grinch stole Christmas. Don and Sal's jaws drop. They have no idea where this came from. Walter congratulates the team and leaves as Pete comes back into the room. Pete accuses Don of taking a compliment for Pete's idea. This really seems to be the moment where Don is set off here, and Don tells him to go get a cardboard box.
He says, nice work, and, good one. Enjoy it. You've got ideas. And then this last insult here that I'm not even getting credit for this good thing. And Don is telling him to get a cardboard box and isn't even looking at him. I mean, that's some cold business. And Pete's face, it goes from, I won everything in the world to how can this possibly be happening? And Sal, not helping at all, just says, you picked the wrong time to buy an apartment. So he's not the friend you want on your side.
It does feel like a cheap shot from Sal. And to see Pete in this scene go from his moment of triumph and achievement, he's finally accomplished something that he's been seeking desperately all episode. And suddenly it's in ashes in front of him. And the look of horror and shock on his face. Again, you're really pulled into the emotions of Pete's character in that moment. And he's starting to see his whole world collapsing around his ears now, with no sense of where this is going to end. As Pete leaves the office, he's clearly on the verge of tears.
Now, granted, If it happened to somebody else in the room, Pete would probably not go out of his way to be nice to somebody else either. I think that's fair to say that if it were Sal, Pete would not be looking out for his feelings. I absolutely agree that Vincent Kartheiser's acting on his walk of shame back to his office is fantastic. You can see the sickness growing on his face with every step, and it is really hard not to feel that pain.
And the frat boys are in his office listening to the comedy records, and Pete yells at them to get out, and Pete's alone in his office.
We cut quickly over to Dawn walking into Roger's room. Remember Pete Campbell's last day? It's today. And Roger immediately gets what's wrong, that Pete was pitching copy to the client without him. Roger doesn't have to be told anymore. He immediately understands the conflict here. And then it cuts back to a shot of Pete drinking with tears in his eyes. They have this transition. The tears in his eyes go all the way down from Pete's face to his shoes and back up to Betty's face at the psychiatrist's office. And both of them are miserable, arguably due to their own choices, but you can't help but feel sadness in both of their situations.
And just going back to when Dawn tells Roger the transgression of Pete, it's very clear Roger and Dawn have no difference of opinion here. Pete has broken the code. The transgression is a firing offense. So Pete will be out. And it's clear that Dawn and Roger are unanimous in this view. We then cut to Betty at the psychiatrist. And again, Betty's not talking about herself. She's talking about Helen, and talking about how Helen seems so exhausted from her job and has to eat or buy frozen food and has to put on a brave face. And it really feels like just a ton of projection where Betty is seeing a reflection of her life. It's not the same life, but at its core, the emotions, the sense of emptiness, of struggle, there's so many parallels here. And for something that cosmetically would seem they have very different lives, here is Betty basically talking about herself, but projecting it to be about Helen.
The person taking care of him isn't giving him what he needs. And she can't say that to anybody about herself, but she can say that and pretend to be sorry for this little boy. Yeah.
And then it's interesting that she says Helen is jealous of her, of Betty, and saying that her real concern is for that poor little boy, Glenn. And again, we think Betty is that poor little boy in her marriage, which perhaps gets back to Weiner's characterization of her as a child. But whether she is a child or not, I think the emotional deficit she's suffering is the same.
And at this point, it's really hard to see how she can find a way out because she really is in a box and she doesn't seem inclined, even if the lid is open a little bit by viewing Helen, she doesn't seem inclined to climb out and really talk about it or face her demons. She seems like she's intent on hiding.
Intent on hiding, but I get the sense that she's also curious about Helen's world. Like, how is this working out for Helen? How does it play out? How does Helen cope? What's Helen doing? Again, not that she's embracing it or seeing it necessarily as a valid path for herself to take, or even that she would want to take it. But I think there's a real curiosity there in Betty of just Helen's taken a different road here. What's going on in that road? How is that affecting her? What would it look like in Betty's world? And I get a feel that Betty's imagining herself in Helen's shoes.
We talked about that a couple of episodes ago, and that was the focus of our double dip question. Again, if you would like to give us some insight about what you think. What is Betty's primary feeling about Helen? Is it curiosity? Is it being threatened? Is it jealousy? So I think that those things are definitely at play. And the more she gets to know Helen, the more she does seem to be curious. I don't disagree. But I think that she has yet to take any steps for herself or even the ability to claim the right to talk about her own needs. Because even here in the privacy of her psychiatrist, which it turns out she doesn't have privacy, which we know, but she doesn't, she's not able to articulate anything that she's missing from her life because she's so busy pretending to herself that everything is okay, which is very sad.
The next scene is Roger and Dawn going in to talk to Bert Cooper about Pete's actions and presumably to get him fired.
Did you catch the moment where they take off their shoes and Roger's wearing lifts and when he takes his shoes off, he's shorter and Dawn looks over at him like, hey.
I missed the lift, so that's a fun one. I'll have to watch for that next time. The conversation quickly goes off the rails. As unified as Roger and Dawn are, we quickly see the hierarchy of the company, and this is a decision where Bert can exercise a veto. He talks about every firm having a Pete Campbell type person, that their value is in their connections, not their creativity or their account management necessarily. Bert says he doesn't want Pete's family hating on Sterling Cooper and speaking about it in all the wrong places. And he doesn't want to lose access to all those social clubs and places that having a Pete Campbell in the firm can open for them. It's a marquee issue, he tells Dawn and Roger. Instantly, we see Roger folding here. He's not going to argue with Bert. He's not pushing back or making any counter arguments. It's clear that Bert's mind's made up, and Roger isn't the one who's going to argue with him. We can also see that Dawn is not at all accepting of this.
When we saw them entering the office, it pans to a photo of Roger's father, Bert's former partner, this photo of Roger as a child on his desk. So you can really see how Roger's position, even as a co-owner, is subservient to Bert. Bert is the guy in charge. That picture says everything about that relationship. Roger does not have the power to go over his head. And he instantly reads the room about it too, because he can see that Dawn is really petulant in the situation. Like, oh, so Pete is more valuable than I am. I mean, he's really, speaking of childish, he's really having a hard time with this. And Roger is both calming Dawn down and assuring Bert that, no, Dawn isn't going to be a problem about this. We can make this work. And he says something even like, Dawn is a big boy, aren't you?
Yeah, it's clear Roger is a Nepo baby in the firm, and Roger knows it. He's too smart not to, and we'll find out that this is a source of insecurity in Roger later in the series. I really liked when Bert tells Dawn he needs to have a stronger stomach.
I have that question because Bert is very pragmatic in terms of business throughout the show. It's very interesting to watch because he comes off like an elder statesman in terms of his attitude. Like maybe he's sort of this kindly guy, but his decisions are often pretty cold-hearted. So that's definitely something to look out through the rewatch of the series.
I see Bert as the voice of reason, but it's a very unsentimental, hard-boiled voice of reason, and it will make the decisions necessary to maximize the welfare of the firm. And when it comes to that, egos, notions of code, you name it, all are sacrificed on that altar. I think Dawn is trying to play that code angle here, not arguing with Bert, but resisting Bert's decision. And it's very clear that Bert won't brook any resistance and seeks positive affirmation from Dawn and Roger that they understand his wishes. Dawn has to bend the knee basically in the scene and say thank you at the end of it. But we can tell his character is just seething at this injustice, at this account man who's broken the code and now is going to be able to get away with it. And my impression is Dawn is so angry that he's likely going to exit the firm. He's not going to be able to reconcile himself with how this has gone down.
He could just barely bite out, well, thank you, sir. And Bert, I'm sure, reads it. But just like he said goody when he was trying to make Dawn commit to the presidential campaign in the last episode, as if there were ever any other choice, he says, oh, I'm glad we're all better now, which definitely seems like something you would say to a child having a disagreement, which, okay, it's maybe a fair comparison because Pete and Dawn have been childish. But it's interesting that Bert sees Dawn as something valuable, and yet he doesn't have any time or energy for his feelings.
And it's a pure power play. Bert is asserting his command of this company and what it's going to do in this situation. And it's not a discussion. He is dictating it to Roger and Dawn.
So at least in contrast to Bert, Roger steps up for Dawn without missing a beat. So I love this next scene. Do you want to take it?
This is one of my favorite scenes in Mad Men. So Roger and Dawn come back to Pete's office where Pete's sitting there dejectedly with his cardboard box. And you're thinking, how is this going to play out? Because somehow they need to tell Pete that he's not fired after Dawn said, put your stuff in the box. Roger tells Pete that he was fired, that Cooper wanted him out, that Roger wanted him out, and then surprises us all and says, but Dawn fought for you. The only reason you're staying here is because of the good graces of this man. He is now your commander-in-chief. He hits Pete with a shot of, I know your generation didn't serve, so let me explain this to you. You live or die in his shadow. Pete has a great line where he says, I won't let you down, Dawn. And Roger responds, Jesus, Campbell, don't ever say that. It's a brilliant scene, and we see Don's face throughout it. At first, he's puzzled with where Roger's going, and then he quickly sees what he's doing here, and he sits there with a scowl on his face and looks very serious. And Rogers basically slipped this through in a way that hopefully won't let Campbell have any sense that what he's just gotten away with wasn't anything to do with Don's decision.
You have some respect. I guess it depends on if you're bothered by the fact that none of it is authentic, but Roger can assess the situation so quickly. When Don comes and says what happened in 2 sentences, Roger's there. He gets it. When he reads Bert and Don, when they're talking to him about firing Pete, Roger assesses this is how it's going to go, and he quickly adjusts. And then they're on the way out of the door from Bert's office. He's already decided how he's going to address Pete. This quickness of being able to move the levers, I think, is pretty impressive. And then Don and Roger go to their office, and then they have the real conversation about the showdown with Pete.
Yeah, and before we jump into that, because I think it's a great scene, I just want to have one little quibble here. It was Don who told Pete to put his stuff in a cardboard box. So to come back now and say Don's the one who fought to keep Pete and give him a second chance, how would Pete interpret that and look at that in hindsight? Would he say, Don was just trying to scare me, but he knows I have good ideas, or he values me enough that he was going to give me a second chance and fought for me against the other 2 when they wanted to proceed with the termination? Or does Pete start to think things aren't quite adding up here?
I don't think Pete has been told no very often, except probably by his father or when he's seeking affection. I think, like Trudy, he's a person who generally gets what he wants. So the idea that he could have been fired, I think, was so shocking in that moment that he's not processing it quickly. But I think you have a point about farther down the road, if he really gave this some thought, he would probably be able to read the tea leaves there.
The next scene is another fantastic scene, very well written, where Roger and Don are talking about what's happened today, and they're having a drink. Roger telling Don to drink for the right reasons, to celebrate, to feel good, accusing Don and his generation of drinking because that's what they think men do, to cover their gloomy thoughts, to lick their imaginary wounds. Don's comeback is again one of the great lines of the episode, saying that perhaps he's not as comfortable being powerless as Roger. Clearly, both men are cutting each other to the quick with their comments.
I think that Don is just taking the shot at Roger because he had to sit there in Bert's office and end up with stupid Pete staying. So he's just punching out. But this is the guy who thought of a way for him to save face. This is the guy who understood why it was wrong. That seems unfair because you're not really punching the guy you mean to punch. But I do think that Roger does him a favor then, too, because he's honest. He says you shouldn't ever compete with Pete Campbell. Unlike some of the other people we've got in the show, he's got color and flash, but Roger has substance. There's more to him. So where Pete is just seeing the advantage or harm to himself, Roger's looking at all the pieces on the board. And when he's chiding Don for this, it seems sincere. I mean, he could have gotten irritated at that comment and stormed out, but he stayed and he gives him some honesty, and then he makes a joke to move forward and make it seem normal again so that Don can save face. So he does seem like he's doing right by Don in this moment.
I like your point there, too, because if we flip it and let's say Roger made a similarly insulting, deep-cutting comment to Don, I think Don does storm out of that office. So I think you've hit on a really key difference here in terms of that extra maturity and seasoning of Roger compared to Don. Roger's not happy with this circumstance any more than Don is. Like you say, Roger's got the maturity and the judgment to realize this isn't a hill to die on and to move past it with the least amount of fuss. Don is going to get to that place, but he's slower to get there. He's more wrapped up in his emotions. And I think you're totally right. Don would not have tolerated a similarly biting remark by Roger in that circumstance to what he threw into Roger's lap. And like you say, Roger lets it go, lets it slide through.
And it does put it into perspective for the viewers, too, to understand Pete is beneath you. You don't need to rise to the bait that Pete is throwing at you. You're above this and, grow up. And so, again, for us all to be framing Betty as a child when Don is behaving this way in this episode, that seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. We've seen a lot of this type of emotional behavior by Don in the early episodes. So I agree. If I were to think who's the more childlike of the two at this point, I'd vote for Don as well over Betty.
And connecting with that, they end that scene where they say, Roger's joke is, I bet there are people in the Bible walking around complaining about kids today. Kids today have no one to look up to because they're looking up to us. How are the grown-ups supposed to grow up? It's the eternal question.
And it's clear that no generation has the answers here. So I think the writing here is touching on that.
So when Pete gets home to Trudy and they're touring the new apartment, did you ever expect that Pete would tell Trudy what happened during the day, or did you expect him to keep it from her?
I would expect he wouldn't tell her about it. He's been on this emotional roller coaster. From what we've seen of Pete to this point, I think he keeps that all bottled up inside, which again means he doesn't have that partner. He doesn't have that friend to open up to. He's got to keep it all bottled up, which just goes back to some of the core problems he faces in his life.
Yeah, and he absolutely does not tell her. Pete is touring this new apartment with Trudy and her parents, and this new neighbor comes over. And the whole tour seems really lonely. He's not taking any joy in it. And again, maybe to his credit, he wanted to earn this for himself, and instead Trudy found a workaround. And you could see that as practical, like, why should they wait, as her father said. But he seems a little bit lost, and it doesn't seem like she needs him for this part. She's telling this story about his family to a crowd, and Pete stands in a corner by himself like he's a prop in her life.
And the irony is they're oohing and awing over his family line. There's a Dyckman in the building, and everybody's basking in that glow of connectivity, except the person who is the actual descendant of the Dyckmans. And he's miserable because he hasn't created or engineered any of this. He's just a passenger to that good fortune.
And with this episode titled New Amsterdam, which was named after the Dutch traded some items to the Manhattan tribe, we see here Pete is on land his family has owned for generations. And Pete has traded something away himself here, and it's something he might not be able to recover.
It really is a poor little rich kid theme to this episode, at least from Pete's standpoint.
Our closing song, Manhattan, was written by Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart. It was published in 1925, and it's about a couple who can't afford the nice things in New York, so they'll enjoy a bunch of more affordable activities together instead. This last shot of Manhattan through the window is a CGI shot.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctozee.com, to vote for your favorite sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at madmenctozee, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.